start off with just
All right.
your
Yeah.
experiences, and then I'll get to some of the stuff about New Orleans and the North Shore. Howard, what were your experiences during World War II?
Well, my most memorable experience was hearing the news report of the Japanese attack on uh, starting World War II at Pearl Harbor. I was sitting on the living room floor in Shreveport. We were living in Shreveport, Louisiana at the time, and I used to listen to the Lone Ranger radio show, and we had a large radio phono console in the living room, and they interrupted the Lone Ranger to announce that the Japanese had bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. And my father picked me up off the floor. I was about 6, 7, and put me on his lap in his big easy chair, and he said, "Son, I want you to try to remember this day, because this will be one of the most important days in your life." And I never forgot that. And I asked him why they interrupted, and he said, "Because it's so important." And of course, our lives changed dramatically thereafter. And he had just bought a brand new Oldsmobile, and he was transferred to Atlanta. And when they instituted gas rationing, we could not get enough gasoline to drive the new car to Atlanta. So he had to sell it. And when we got to Atlanta, we bought a used Plymouth because there were no new cars left to buy. And we used that used Plymouth until 1947. Now the war ended in 45, but it took the automobile industry a couple of years to retool from wartime production to civilian production. So there were comparatively few new cars in 46. The real wave came in 47.
Did you get involved in any of the stuff that kids did, like the scrap drives
Oh,
and all of that?
I was going to say that I was thinking about this yesterday. When I went to school, I took something to school for the war effort every day. One day a week, we bundled our newspapers with string, and you took the newspapers. The next day, you saved every tin can and every metal jar lid and so forth, and these were taken to school one day a week. Another day a week, you took all the fat, all the cooking oil, bacon drippings that weren't used in Southern cooking. All of that was taken in cans to school, and somehow none of that fat was reprocessed. Another day, and it shocks me to think that we had, but toothpaste came in lead tubes, and you'd roll up the toothpaste tube, and odd little pieces of metal, and they would be taken to school another day. And on Fridays, you took a quarter, and for a quarter, you bought a stamp, and you had a book, a savings book, about so wide and about that high, and you put a stamp, you had pages. It was like green stamps used to be at the grocery store. You'd come home and, well, here you bought a stamp, and when you had filled your little booklet, you had $18.75, which is what it took to purchase a $25 U.S. war bond. And in my school days, I think that I earned 7 or 8 $25 war bonds over the years with those little stamps.
Were you in Atlanta for the whole time?
No. We moved back to New Orleans in 1943. And so I was in New Orleans during the latter part of the war, and by that time it seemed to me that it was just very normal that rationing of of canned goods and food, shoes. Rubber tires were just impossible to get for cars. We just learned to do with less, and I didn't feel a sense of privation because I didn't know anything more. And just a year ago, I gave a collection of my toys to the World War II Museum in New Orleans because I found them in a box in the attic, and they were all wooden, little wooden Jeeps, and I did have a metal, it was called a friction toy. You'd push it on the floor, and then the friction would drive the little tank on, and I had a tin tank, but everything else was wood. And the World War II Museum was delighted to get them because not many people are such pack rats that they got their toys from age 7, 8, 9, at 77.
What did your father do in New Orleans?
My father was the operating.
Before you answer that question, let me fix your mic real quick.
Okay.
Starting to flip over a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Great story. All right. I am similarly a pack rat, so I can relate to that. When my dad died, I found a bunch of my old toys still in boxes in the attic.
Yeah.
All right, Bill, you can go ahead with that question again.
Okay, what did your dad do in New Orleans?
My dad was the operating superintendent for Sears on the corner of Barone and Common near the Roosevelt Hotel. And he was the number 2 man at the store. And because of his position, he was granted some kind of extra ration coupons for gasoline. And we bought a summer place over on Bayou Lacombe about 1943, 44, I guess, 44 maybe. And so we could go over there on weekends. And they eventually even installed a telephone way out, we were 2 miles from the little village of Lacombe. And they had, because he worked with the Red Cross, he worked when Chet Morrison was mayor, he had some kind of unpaid position, but anytime there was an emergency, he was in charge of transportation. And so for all of these kind of ancillary reasons, he had a little better situation than a lot of people in the city. And I remember there was a hurricane in 1946 or 47, and my mother and I did not see him for 3 days because he was working in City Hall. But he was able to go into stores and requisition cots and supplies for the Red Cross and emergency shelters and all that kind of thing. So, and one thing he did that I remember, they used to have, they called them war bond shows at the old municipal auditorium. And I got to meet Gene Kelly when I was a kid because he was there and Dad was, this was part of his Red Cross business. And so Dad took me backstage, and I was just a little shaver, and Gene Kelly, of course, was an adult. But he was already a hero of mine because he was in the movies and I'd seen him. And I've always treasured that recollection. But you paid so much money to get a ticket, and in effect what you did is you bought a war bond to get a ticket to see the shows, and they brought in nationally prominent entertainers and so on.
I've seen a photograph in which one of the Mardi Gras crews during the war, when they weren't having Mardi Gras, did some sort of bond show like that. Do you know anything about that one?
Not offhand, no.
The photograph is just there, so it's
Yeah.
obvious they're doing. I think it's Bacchus, but I'm not sure.
Well, no, Bacchus is a post.
Is it? All right. Well,
Yeah.
I'm not sure then.
Yeah,
I may have just put that into my head, but
it may have been Rex, though, because they're very civic-minded as the Mystery Crew. No, that's Comus. Let's say the School of Design is the Rex name.
but during the war, with the talk, of German submarines in the Gulf and all that sort of stuff, did people in New Orleans ever feel any sense of danger?
Well, I really don't know because I was a kid, but I do remember that in schools we had blackout curtains on the windows, and we would have bomb drills where you'd get down under your desk. And in retrospect, as an adult, I've read about the reports of German subs off the mouth of the river and so forth, but as a kid, that didn't resonate with me at all. I just don't remember anything about that.
What do you remember about the end of the war?
Oh, the end of the war, we were at our place in Lacombe, and we were going to take my former fourth grade teacher out to dinner that Sunday night. And we started driving into the city, and suddenly all the people in the other cars were blinking their headlights. And so we finally turned on the car radio and learned that the Japanese had surrendered. And by the time we got into the city of New Orleans, there was not a business open. And we had planned to take this teacher out to dinner, and so we had to feed her at home, and all my mother could come up with was a can of Spam. And so she put cloves in it and warmed it in the oven. And I remember it with great distaste, and I have never eaten Spam since.
So the celebration didn't work out too well for you.
Not for us, but they're wonderful pictures of just the crowds on Canal Street and so forth. I mean, it was just a time of unrestrained joy. And a few months after that, my father and I were swimming at the old Audubon Park swimming pool, and they announced on the loudspeaker system that the government had just ended car rationing. Car tire rationing, and my father grabbed me and said, "We're getting out of here." And we dried off and changed into our clothes, and he dashed out and bought 4 new tires for his car.
Got to be quick on your feet, right?
Oh, amen.
Well, I'm going to ask you to put on your historian hat here
Okay.
for a second. This will probably be a combination of your experiences and also Howard, the historian. How did the war affect culture in New Orleans?
Well, the suspension of Mardi Gras was really major. And Mardi Gras was, much more so then than now, a very carefully paced social system. And people, that really disrupted the normal debutante system. And when the war ended and they brought Mardi Gras back, there were just about 5 old crews: Rex, Comus, Momus, Proteus. Probably Mid-City was parading early. But I can remember the throws. Today you see the streets littered with beads, but it was very rare to get a throw in '46. That was the first year they came back. And I still have a little clay dog that my father caught. Now, we saw every parade that first year, and he caught one thing. And on the bottom of it, it had a note saying that it was made in Czechoslovakia. And of course, today, Carnival throws, that's a big business. It certainly, the port made New Orleans potentially very, very vulnerable. And the refinery at Baton Rouge. So in Louisiana, there was a great concern that we would be an object of attack, and the whole lakefront was military installations. You could drive through. There was a naval air station out there, and there was some kind of army installation, and one of those is the campus today of the University of New Orleans. And when they first opened UNO, they were using World War II military buildings as facilities until they had an opportunity to build their own. And we used to, our idea of a big night out was to have a picnic lunch out on the seawall. And in those days, people took lanterns and put them down on the seawall, and then they'd stand down in the water with these huge shrimp nets. And the shrimp would be attracted by the light in the darkness, and they'd come in, and then they'd, and so we frequently had fresh seafood as a lanyard to take home from an evening picnic in the latter years of the war. Movie-going was tremendously important during the war. It was one of the major ways you obtained news about the war. They had 5 10-minute shorts called newsreels. And so you'd go and see a feature film, and there would be a newsreel. And the news was always about 3 or 4 weeks late. I mean, you were seeing military footage both from the European theater and the Asiatic theater, but well after those events had happened and the war had moved on in some other place by the time we saw that. But it was the latest news we had, so we were excited. And of course, it conditioned childhood culture in the sense that you played Germans and Americans rather than cops and robbers. I mean, that was the kind of common denomination, and that continued after the war in the Cold War when it became the Russians and the Americans. And I'm not sure that we ever fully extirpated that from our culture. There were a series of grand movie palaces in New Orleans. And the Sanger, the Lowe State, I'm hard pressed. One of the wonderful old movie theaters was the Civic that's just being renovated in the CBD. It used to open on St. Charles. Now it's going to open, the entrance is going to be on O'Keefe Avenue. But you went to these places and it was a great escape. First of all, they had air conditioning. And air conditioning was not common during the war. And so shoe stores and movie theaters were two places that you knew you could go and get cool. Today we take air conditioning for granted as a given, but it certainly wasn't at the time of World War II. widespread air conditioning as a post-World War II development. There was a great sense of patriotism. Every school class said the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of every school day, and you sang the Star Spangled Banner, and there was a wonderful popular singer named Kate Smith. And Kate Smith was a very heavy woman. She was not pretty, but she had a gorgeous voice. And this was the days of radio. And so you crowded around the radio for the news and for entertainment. And Kate Smith sang an Irving Berlin song that was written at the time of the war, God Bless America. And I can, on occasion, still tear up when I hear that, because when they talk about the White Cliffs of Dover, that just speaks to my childhood memories very strongly.
Why shoe stores?
I have no idea. Now, I imagine that baby bars were air conditioned too, but as a child, I had no acquaintanceship with such facilities.
Maybe the clerks didn't want to deal with people with sweaty feet. I don't know, but that one, I expected movie theaters, but when you said shoe stores, it was like, no, that's different.
Well, they used to. You could walk down Canal Street, and the shoe stores would have their doors open, and there'd be this, this wonderful cold air coming out. It was just heavenly. And that was another thing. The war reduced our sense of sartorial elegance. My mother wore gloves and a hat to go to Canal Street and shop. I mean, that was just what ladies did. And today, everything is so casual and so informal, and we'd all be bums if we were suddenly transported in our garb back to Canal Street of the World War II era. That may be a tremendous, and then of course, public transportation was a basic element of life, in part because of gas rationing, the scarcity of tires and cars and so on. And after World War II, everybody wanted their own car. And at one time, with my two children, we were a 4-car family. Now that's ridiculous. I mean,
I feel your pain. When did you move to Covington?
In 1947.
So you were there in time to see how the war had affected the North Shore as well. I would think.
Well, the North Shore was such a quiet, simple place. And it's absolutely fascinating for me to drive, say, down 190 from Covington to Mandeville and see the megalopolis that's being birthed there. And when it used to all be pine trees. And Mandeville was a little tiny place, and there was an old restaurant on the beach called Bishak's. And the Bishak family had a cement tank about the size of this desk or table in their kitchen. And they'd live fish in there. And when you ordered a flounder or something, they reached in and grabbed a flounder. And when they offered fresh fish on the menu, it was fresh. It was killed right then and there. And there were two old gentlemen who had served as waiters there for 40 or 50 years. And I don't remember their names anymore, and I'm embarrassed that I don't. But when I was a kid, everybody knew them by their first names. And they wore white coats. And there were maybe, I would think, fewer than 1,000 people living in Mandeville. right after the war. And of course, the major change was the causeway, which had been dreamed about in the 20s and actually projected, but didn't materialize until the 1950s. But it was that just took I'm writing a book on Covington right now, and in the introduction I say that it's still an idyllic place because it's nestled between two rivers, the Bogafalaya and the Tchefuncte, and while there's been change, the change has been limited, and most of the growth, the commercial growth, is outside of this little nexus of 200 years of human habitation.
Right.
And it's older than Mandeville.
My grandmother's youngest sister lived there for years. She was married to Jake Plummer.
Oh, really?